Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Second Son Woodworks. My name is Caleb, and today I'm going to be continuing a series on this memory/lockbox that I have been building out of walnut and oak. And today I'll be chatting specifically about the lid of the box, as well as some splines, some oak splines that I'll be inserting into the corners of the box. And then lastly, I'll be chatting about the fancy brass hardware that I picked up off of Rockler.com that I will be installing. You can see here that I am cutting the box into two separate pieces on my table saw so that I can get the lid and the base of the box. If you haven't seen the previous episode where I discussed the continuous grain and how to get continuous grain around the edges of a box, check out that episode. But then after I cut the lid off, I go ahead and pull out my spline jig. There's also a episode on how to build this really simple spline jig to use on your table saw to cut splines into the corners of a box. Also, I want to just give a shout out for all those folks who are new to Second Son Woodworks. If you haven't stopped by my channel before, welcome. I hope that you enjoy some of this content and learn a little bit about woodworking and or other DIY projects. Adding splines to a box is not only a good way to reinforce the mitered joints on those sidewalls, depending on the thickness of your spline, but also I think it adds a nice aesthetic touch to the box itself. I'm using oak for the splines themselves into the sidewalls, which are dark walnut, and I like that contrast. Some people would prefer to probably put walnut, but for myself, I like the contrast. Once the actual cuts on the sidewalls into those miter joints had been cut with the spline jig, I went over to my little tabletop Ryobi bandsaw to cut the actual pieces of wood that will be inserted into those cut marks and actually serve as the splines themselves. And like I said, I'll be cutting these out of oak. You could do this on a table saw or even on your chop saw, but you want to make sure that the pieces themselves fit pretty snug into those cuts so that when you add some glue, it dries and it actually creates a nice joint. There's also probably some good ways that you can ensure that each piece is cut to the exact same thickness, whether that be running it through some sort of belt sander or a planer or making yourself a stop block. But for me, I just went ahead and tried to eyeball them as best as I could. I found a reference place on the actual bandsaw itself where I could move over the piece of oak and eyeball it, and they ended up turning out pretty well. After that, I took the stack of splines that I had cut down over to the box, and I started inserting them into the 16 different cuts, 4 in each corner, to create these little spline joints using some tight bond 2. Like I said, I made sure that the spline fit pretty snug into the cuts themselves so that it created a good joint for these miters. After inserting the 16 splines into the corners of the box and letting it dry overnight, I came back the next day and sawed off with my pole saw the excess on each of those oak splines. When you're doing this, it's good to try and not scratch up too much of the actual walnut sidewalls so that when you come back and sand down these corners, there's no deep marks. After that, I took some Minwax walnut colored wood putty and filled in some of the voids around the miters of the box as well as the interior side. This is a good way to ensure that a box like this looks just a bit more perfect, I guess. I don't actually think that perfect is a real thing, so I take that back. Makes it look nice though. After that, I used a little trick that I picked up off of the good old YouTube to round over the corners, make those miters look a bit nicer. All it is essentially using a hard tool such as a screwdriver or a wrench and rubbing in the corners into the center of the miter. Another little video where I explain that. Check it out. Once I finished making those mitered corners look just a bit better, I took the opportunity to go over to my fancy Craftsman router table and use a 1/4 round bit to round over the edges of the lid and then the top of the bottom section. I rounded over the actual corners of the top and bottom of the box in the previous video, but since now I have access to the bottom side of the box as well as the top of the main part of the box, because I cut them into 2 different sections, I went ahead and rounded them over. After that, it was time to start the process of adding this Rockler hardware that I picked up. The first pieces were the quadrant brass hinges. These are some special hinges that actually go into the side walls of the boxes. And they take a bit of work to install, but the first step is to mark out the area in which you will be routering out the section on the side walls that will sit the first part of the quadrant hinge, or the lower half, I guess. I also marked out the section for the lock, which is a humidor box lock. And then you can see here that I'm just making sure that I got those markings set correctly for the back section quadrant hinge. After that, I set the depth of a 1/4 inch shank on my palm router to the height of the quadrant hinge, or at least 1/2 of the quadrant hinge that would be inserted into the main section of the box. When boring out the sections for the quadrant hinges, I made sure to clamp the work piece, the box, down to my bench, and then I only took out a bit of the area where the quadrant hinge will sit, and then the rest of it I'll come back with a chisel and make the area, more defined. This is important so that you don't bore out too much and have to patch it, which happened for the first box that I did with these hinges. If you just slowly creep up onto the lines, you should get a nice and clean fit, or at least that's the way that it worked out for me. So, stoked about that. After that, I went over to the other side of the box, the other back corner of the box where I had the other quadrant hinge, and I repeated the same exact steps. After finishing the areas where the 2 separate quadrant hinges sat, I went ahead and moved to the center of the front wall of the box where I would be inserting this humidor lock. Once again, I routed out the majority of the section, finished it with a chisel, made sure it fit, and then I'll have to come back to that same spot and do a deeper groove in the middle where the actual lock section is dropped down into the box. But before doing that, I went ahead and went over to the lid, marked out the areas where the quadrant hinges would be sitting on the lid, and worked on getting those routed out. When you get these areas routed out and then chiseled out pretty accurately, it's a very satisfying experience when you get to press the hinge into that section and it fits well. So take your time and don't rush this process. Enjoy it. After that, I use my pencil to mark out the area where the actual quadrant arm will be going into the side wall of both the lid and the main box, and then I used a drill to drill that area out with just a drill. You could use a router bit, but it's a little less easy to control than just using a drill, so I ended up boring out the majority of this hole with just my drill and a larger bit, and then I kind of moved around and used a chisel as well to bore out some more of the section so that that arm could go into both the lid as well as into the main box. If you look at the hardware, there's a link in the description below for this hardware. You'll know more of what, or it'll make more sense. The great part about this section that you bore out is that it's not going to be seen. It'll actually be sitting underneath the hinges themselves, so they don't have to look pretty. They just need to be able to accept the arm when the box opens and closes. This is the second time that I've used this hardware on a box like this, and I gotta say that this second time went a lot better than the first time. So if you do actually end up using this hardware, I'd recommend testing out the cuts on some other wood before you move on to doing it on the nice wood, especially if if you have a box glued up and it's continuous grain. You already have those splines in there and whatnot. So you can also check out the other videos where I did the previous box if you haven't already. After that, I went back to the area where the humidor lockbox hardware would be sitting into the front wall, and I also used my drill to bore out the area where the actual lock mechanism sits down into the sidewall. And then you actually drill a hole on the front face of the box where you insert the actual key, and they have this hardware comes with a little brass round section that will pop into the hole that you drill out. You'll see that in a second, but then it makes it pretty easy to set up the whole lock so that it can accept this key that it comes with. So check out that hardware if you haven't already. Like I said, there is a link in the description below. It's from Rockler. After that, I made sure to pre-drill holes for the little screws that attach the actual lock to the box, and as well as the different quadrant hinges. And then this is important so that you don't, break one of those little screws and or crack the wood itself. So make sure you do pre-drill some holes. And then I started attaching everything to the box so that I could do a test fit. Before I actually finish and sand down the box and whatnot, I will take the hardware back off, but at this point I wanted to make sure that everything fit and that those hinges close correctly. You can see here that I'm doing some adjustments as I add the quadrant hinges to the box. Kind of a tricky process attaching the lid after you've attached the hinges to the main box, because you actually have to have those little quadrant arms already inserted into the hinge before you attach them. So what I did is I just set up some wood that I could lay the box up against while I attach the lid, and when it actually works, it's satisfying. After that, I realized that I needed to drill out the hole for the key on the front section for that lockbox humidor hardware piece. And you can see here that I'm drilling out a hole, and like I said, it comes with a little round brass piece that goes into that hole and makes it look really nice. I don't actually attach that until later on because I will finish it first. And make sure when you're drilling this that you don't drill through the other side, so push lightly. That happened on the last box and it wasn't fun to patch. The next step in the process was to mark out the area where the part of the hardware would sit on the lid, and you have to wait to mark this out until you have the lid attached so that it actually goes in the right section. And once again, it's got kind of two levels of boring that's needed for the actual section, one being for the hardware itself, and then within the center is a deeper bored out area where the lock mechanism actually flips over into when you turn the key. And then I made sure that everything worked. There was a little bit of adjustments that were needed, and I needed to make that hole a little bit deeper after the first attempt, but this hardware is really awesome, and I would definitely recommend it. Alright folks, that is the conclusion, or just about the conclusion of this video in this series on making a memory box. I hope that you learned just a bit about doing the lid, as well as this hardware that I picked up off of Rockler. Check out the links in the description below. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. If you haven't hit the subscribe button, I'd really appreciate it if you did that right now. And like I always say, get in the shop and build something cool. Alright folks, take care.